just get right to it. My name is Devin Rodgers. I'm a botanist with the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. I've been here for about 3 years, a little over 3 years. So I've been kind of learning as I go. I moved up from Tennessee and was originally from Maryland before that. So I've come to really love Kentucky, and what I'm going to be talking about with my talk is biodiversity and regions and some of the broad patterns in biodiversity that we get across the regions of Kentucky, because it provides an important context for knowing why the plants in any given part of the state are important in reference to why they're special in that region, and maybe not something that you can expect in another region. So to begin, biodiversity is important not only for recreation and aesthetics, but also has a right to exist in its own. Healthy, biodiverse natural areas provide not only raw materials for the economy, but also ecosystem services such as clean water, moderation of temperatures, carbon storage, a whole host of benefits. And when we say biodiversity, there are differing levels of biodiversity. You can have genetic diversity within a population of a given species, but also you can have an interaction of lots of different species in any given one natural community. And then the diversity of natural communities across a landscape can be classified as ecosystem diversity. And it's important to know with Kentucky some of the historic disturbances that have led to the biodiversity that we encounter today. Prior to European settlement, there were large herds of animals, such as bison and elk pictured here. Some of the reasons we know that these things existed were from firsthand accounts of the long hunters that came over the Cumberland Gap to hunt some of these animals, and encountered lots of bison traces or buffalo traces, and additionally wildfire and winter weather events similar to what we've been going through, as well as tornadoes, thunderstorms. These are all important disturbances that change or affect biodiversity across the landscape. And lastly, it's important to comment that Native Americans utilize prescribed fire across the state to maintain ecosystems. And the lack of prescribed fire in a lot of those systems has led to a lot of changes in biodiversity, and is also probably causing the declines in a lot of our rare species. Now, since settlement, there have been a number of large-scale disturbances, such as urbanization, the damming of streams and rivers for hydroelectric power, agricultural development for livestock and crops, logging, as well as mining. And one of the cool figures that we have in that Kentucky's Natural Heritage book is a map displaying what we estimate the land cover was prior to settlement, as well as what it is in the current day. So when we look at the differences between pre-settlement and now, we've seen a 30 to 40% reduction in the cover of forested land, around a 99% reduction of the cover of native grasslands and prairies, and over an 85% reduction in the cover of wetlands. And so while we do still have a lot of forests, a lot of our wetlands and grasslands are very much reduced, and a lot of rare species declines are associated with losses of wetlands and grasslands. But we still have a lot of large forest tracts. A lot of our largest forest tracts are in the eastern part of the state, but we also see some down near the Cumberland River, some areas of the Knobs, the Shawnee Hills, and the Land Between the Lakes area. And another thing to notice that you see on this map, there's kind of like these smaller areas of light brown that indicate smaller forest patches. So even though those aren't showing up as brightly on this map, those are still significant areas of forest. It's just that they're a little bit more patchy and not as well connected. But connectivity is very important for having ecosystem diversity and functioning ecosystem diversity over large spaces. So we have a number of different ecological corridors that I guess are more of an active effort to conserve land in some of these corridors. But naturally, some areas just end up being, very large corridors of relatively natural lands. And you see that a lot in the eastern part of the state, where we have the national forests, but also just a lot of forested land on private land. One of these more active projects for ecological corridors we can see on Pine Mountain, where state agencies and nonprofits and land conservancies, and as well as the Forest Service, the accumulation of protected lands on Pine Mountain creates a greater than 100-mile mountain corridor, which is really important for a lot of rare species and plants and animals that can migrate however they want within that corridor and be relatively safe from the impacts of man. Now, when we get to thinking about differences in regional biodiversity, it's important to note differences in the elevation, the temperature, precipitation, and geology. When we look at topography, generally out west, we get lower elevations. A lot of the lowest elevations are along our big rivers out there. So the lowest point in the state is at 257 feet with the Mississippi River. And as we go east, we see with those lighter green colors, some higher elevations, but generally, between 400 to 700 feet for most of the central part of the state. And as we get out to the eastern part of the state, anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 feet at Black Mountain. And with those changes in elevation, we see changes in temperature and rainfall, with the western part of the state being a little bit warmer with a little bit higher rainfall. And as you continue east and north, cooler temperatures and a little bit less precipitation. Now, the geology I'm going to go into a little bit more with some of these other sections, but it's just important to know that as you get out of the coastal plain in the western part of the state, you cross into an area which the majority of Kentucky is underlain by Paleozoic rocks. These are all rocks that range from 250 to 500 million years old and really dominate how the land is shaped, as well as how soils develop and thus plants and animals occur there. And looking at the regions around the state, we have a lot of influences that have shaped our current flora, such as the northern temperate forest from the north, the Appalachian Mountains to the east, east, north, and south, the coastal plain to the south, and the Midwestern prairies from the west. Now, there are different ways that we can talk about regions depending on what source you use, but some of the main physiographic provinces, and physiography is basically the study of the shape of the land. And a lot of that has to do with the underlying geology and how that has eroded over time. But we recognize 3 physiographic provinces. The coastal plain is in the west, the interior low plateaus is in the center of the state, and the Appalachian Highlands are in the east. Now this map is just showing, I'm not going to go too much into all these different EPA ecoregions, but the EPA maintains a list of what they call ecoregions, which are areas of similar plants and animals that occur predictably within certain areas of similar geology. But this is a good resource to look at if you want to learn a little bit more about what shapes the biodiversity of where your parks are. And yet again, a different map of the natural regions. This is what we have in the Kentucky Natural Heritage book that we're going to be referring to as I walk through the different natural regions. But important to know, still recognizing the coastal plain in the west, interior low plateau in the center, and the Appalachian Highlands in the east. So before I walk through some of those different regions, just wanted to classify what some of these natural communities I'm talking about actually mean. Prairies and glades are native grassland systems that are open and dominated by grasses and wildflowers. But then if you get scattered trees, but not a closed canopy, you can call that natural community a woodland. And then with cliffs, if the cliff is facing north and tends to have a lot of moisture, it can be called a wet cliff or a moist cliff. If it gets a lot of sunlight, it can be called a dry cliff. And then you'll also notice in this ravine here near the stream, it says mesic forest. But you also see mesic forest to the left on this north-facing slope. And mesic forests usually occur on low slopes, regardless of what direction they're facing, or north-facing slopes. And mesic basically means moisture-loving. So these are forests that have dense shade, and even when it rains, it retains a lot of that humidity. So these are just like very rich forest types. But then if you get up onto a ridge, you might have a xeric forest, which basically means like very dry, or a dry forest. Xeric forests usually occur on our driest south-facing exposures, usually high on slopes. And then as we get down into river valleys, we have swamps, which are usually permanently inundated wetlands that have trees or shrubs. Now, if you get into in an area that is permanently inundated but has nothing but herbaceous plants, you can call it a marsh. And if you're in a permanently inundated place that has no vegetation, generally call it a lake, in which case you're getting more into aquatic communities as opposed to terrestrial communities, which I'm focusing on. And then bottomland hardwood forest is a hardwood forest that occurs next to rivers. They flood a lot, but they don't always hold water for the entire or long portions of the year. Now, some of those wetland types are very important on the coastal plain. What you'll notice in this area, some of the dominant natural features are these shallow river valleys that have complexes of different wetland types. And we see this along the Mississippi, the Ohio, as well as some of the tributaries, whether it's the Clarks River, the Blood River, Obion Creek, Terrapin Creek, Biota Chain, and it's really noticeable when you get out into these areas, especially with the presence of bald cypress. These bald cypress swamps are pretty rare for us, just because there's been a lot of alteration of some of the river valleys, but we see a lot of bald cypress. It's a really cool coniferous tree that occurs in a lot of these wetlands. And then it's also notable that there's more than just wetlands. We have mesic forests that occur on slopes as you get out of those river valleys. And this screenshot is showing a typical scene in the Jackson Purchase of West Kentucky. A lot of the uplands are very rich soils that have mostly been converted to agriculture. Prior to settlement, this was an area of extensive prairie called Jackson Purchase prairies. Virtually no examples exist of these prairie types. There are some prairie species that still occur on the roadsides, but most of the natural areas that you encounter in this part of the state occur in these major river corridors and are mostly wetlands. So we get a lot of different wetland specialist species, but because this is the coastal plain, we have a lot of coastal plain species that occur in these wetlands that occur there and nowhere else in the state. As we move east, we're getting towards the interior plateau, and this is the largest physiographic province or natural region in Kentucky, and has a lot of differences, regional differences. So if you're in the Highland Rim, this is mostly a flat to rolling plain underlain by limestone, and then a little bit to the north and west is the Shawnee Hills, where even though there's a lot of limestone, there's also some sandstone exposures, and another thing notable about the Shawnee Hills is just these big river valleys and all the wetlands that are associated with them. As you continue east and north, the Knobs is a region of a lot of shaly knobs that encircle the bluegrass and form these conical shapes. You'll see a picture in the bottom center, kind of illustrating some of those knob-like features. And then when we get up into the bluegrass, a lot of limestone and dolomite, fairly hilly in spots, but also flat and plain-like in spots. This screenshot is showing I-75 going south of Lexington as you cross the Kentucky River. This is a typical scene from the interior low plateaus where a lot of the uplands with really rich soils have been converted to agriculture or urban development, but a lot of the natural areas that remain are along these river corridors where the land is just too steep to build on and it's too steep to farm. We see a similar scenario getting down near the Cumberland River, where a lot of the remaining forested natural lands are areas that are hilly. Some of the communities you might expect here are calcareous mesophytic forest is a forest type that has very rich herbaceous flora, usually forms over the rich soils derived from limestone. But we also have extensive oak hickory forests in some of the upper slopes and ridges in this area. And then there's a lot of caves. We're not going to be covering caves today because we're mostly focusing on plants, but it's important to notice that we have a lot of special biodiversity in caves, and we do have a lot of caves in the interior low plateaus region. And then additionally, this region has some of the highest occurrences of native grasslands and prairies and glades and barrens. So if you're looking at if you're in a river valley or a creek valley in the interior low plateaus, and it's mostly limestone, on some of your north-facing slopes, you can get these really mesophytic, rich forests and maybe wet cliff. But if you get up onto a more dry cliff or bluff, you can get dry limestone cliffs and outcrops of woodlands. And then you can also get mesophytic forests on low slopes as you get closer to creeks, and occasionally small stream scour forests or cobble bars that occur along the creeks. And it's important to highlight all these different systems like this because the plants will change as you go from one habitat to another. And that is good for ecosystem diversity, but it's also good that you have multiple places where you can encounter specialist species that are adapted to those conditions. And the interior plateau is really big, and it's got a lot of limestone and a lot of species that you see regardless of which river system you're in. But I wanted to point out that each of these regions that I have circled here have their own host of special rare plants that just occur in those regions. And so whether you're in the northern bluegrass with the Licking River and the Ohio River, or the Kentucky River Palisades, the Upper Cumberland River, Green River watershed and some of its tributaries, or the Lower Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, each of these regions have special rare plants that are associated with them. And I mentioned glades and prairies earlier, just so you're aware. Glades are a native grassland type that are dominated by gravelly soils, bedrock that is close to the surface, and because of those rocky conditions, they have their own suite of specialist plants that like that habitat and are adapted to it. And then prairies are a natural native grassland type that have deeper soils, and so they're not as what we call edaphically controlled as glades are. This map is just showing where we have some of the most extensive documentation of native grassland types of glades and prairies. Whether it's the Shawnee Hills and the Highland Rim, the southwestern knobs, the Highland Rim in the vicinity of the Cumberland River, or the Upper Licking River in the bluegrass. And then, like I said before, this map showing caves, and caves are very, very big, important natural features in this region, and we have quite a lot of them. And last thing, I didn't want to forget about the Shawnee Hills, but you might get sandstone exposures with cliffs, rock houses, and these are pretty cool places that have their own unique flora, but also sometimes mountain species jump out into the sandstone ravines of the Shawnee Hills. This is just highlighting a couple plants. This area has really rich spring wildflower displays in the forests. But also as you get out into your native grasslands, you can really see some showy wildflower displays regardless of the time of the year. And moving on to the Appalachian Highlands, it's important to note that the eastern edges of the Appalachian, or at least the eastern portions of the Appalachian Highlands, are a dissected plateau. And so you have a flat to rolling surface that is intersected by very steep river gorges, whether it's the Big South Fork, the Rock Castle, the Cumberland, the Red River, the Kentucky River. All these rivers really dissect steeply through these regions and create these sandstone bluffs that they're really noticeable if you go there. And as you go east from those plateaus, you get into an area that sometimes is called the Cumberland Mountains. I think on this map here it's dissected Appalachians, but these hills rise well above the surface of that plateau to the west, and they're extensive shale and sandstone deposits that create those dissected mountains, which are of course different from what we also call the Cumberland Mountains, which is Pine Mountain, Cumberland Mountain, Black Mountain, Log Mountain. All those areas are part of the Cumberland Mountains and are higher elevation than these other regions in Appalachia. So we get a wide variety of natural communities out this way, and the density of natural communities probably leads to the density of biodiversity and rare species, of which this area is a hot spot for us in Kentucky. So we have, of course, mesophytic forests. You'll see a lot of hemlock in these systems, but we also have acid seep wetlands, sandstone cliffs and rock houses, and actually a high density of fire-dependent pine oak systems in the uplands. So we're looking at a demonstration or an illustration of these areas. If you're in the dissected gorges of the plateau, a lot of times you can have pine oak hickory forests and savannas, acid seep wetlands, and even regionally distinct prairie types that occur up on the flat to rolling surfaces. But as you get down into the gorges and the dissected hilly landscapes, you get cliffs and rock houses and rich forests. And then occasionally you get cobble bars, which I believe it's just Cumberland Falls State Park that has globally rare grassland type vegetation that occurs on the rocky shoals going downstream and upstream of the falls. And also on Pine Mountain, land is shaped a little bit different because the rocks are turned up and it's not like a plateau. And you can get pine oak heath forests and sandstone outcrops on the dry ridges, and then mesic forests with a lot of hemlock and tall deciduous trees in the ravines. And there's a lot of specialist plants out in this region, like a lot of species of rhododendrons and azaleas. You get 4 different species of magnolias. There's a lot of really special orchids that grow in the forests here, but also in wetlands, and a lot of coverage of pine. That's really noticeable when you go into that Appalachian Highlands. You get a lot of shortleaf Virginia pine, of course, but shortleaf pine and pitch pine, which are both fire-adapted species. And then I guess there's some white pine too, but I know the native status of that is a little bit questionable in some parts of the state. But I think that is all I wanted to cover with some of these regions and what to expect. But it's important to know your regions because it helps you appreciate why the plants in your part of the state are different from those in the other parts of the state. So I encourage you to look at some of the resources that we're going to send to you guys about learning more about the regions and how that helps shape biodiversity.